Welcome back to our channel. Today we embark on a journey far into the past to a world both fascinating and harsh, a world ruled by kings, lords, and the unyielding structure of feudal society. We are about to uncover what it truly meant to live as a serf in medieval England, to experience life tied to the land, burdened with obligations, yet finding moments of humanity, resilience, and community within a rigid hierarchy. Imagine standing in a small village surrounded by rolling hills, thick forests, and fields stretching as far as the eye can see. The village is a simpler cluster of thatched cottages made of wattle and daub. Smoke rises from chimneys as light breaks over the horizon. The castle dominates the skyline, a constant reminder of power and authority. Within this landscape, the majority of people are serfs, a class of peasants bound to the land they inhabit. They are neither slaves nor free citizens, but their lives are profoundly shaped by the feudal system that governs every aspect of existence. Serfdom was not just a condition, it was a way of life. For a serf, being born into this world meant inheriting a set of obligations, responsibilities, and restrictions. From the moment they first drew breath, there was no choice in the matter. Your parents, your village, and even your marriage were all influenced by the lord who controlled the land. The social and economic framework of medieval England dictated that serfs work the land, maintain the lord's estate, and contribute a portion of their own harvest as a form of tax or tribute. In exchange, they could live on the land and were offered protection, but freedom remained limited, and autonomy was a rare luxury to truly understand the life of a serf. We must first understand the structure of medieval society. England during the Middle Ages was divided into estates, each controlled by a lord who owed allegiance to a higher noble or the king himself. This hierarchy was strict and unyielding. At the top were the monarchs whose rule extended over vast territories. Below them were nobles and knights, the holders of land, wealth, and military power. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the serfs. Their lives revolved around serving the needs of those above them, ensuring that the machinery of feudal society continued to function. For serfs, the village was both a home and a place of labor. Their cottages were humbly from, with a hearth at its center where the family cooked and slept. Floors were usually packed earth, and furniture was sparse. A table, a few stools, and simple beds were all a family might possess. The living quarters were cramped, yet serfs made them as functional and comfortable as possible, using what they had to survive the rigors of daily life. Life as a serf was dictated by work. The year was divided by the agricultural calendar, and every season brought its own tasks and demands. In spring, fields had to be plowed and sown. The earth was prepared for a new cycle of crops. Summer required constant vigilance. Fields needed tending, weeds had to be removed, and livestock required care. Autumn was harvest time, the most critical season when the fruits of months of labor were gathered, measured, and often divided between the lord and the peasants. Winter brought a different rhythm. Fields lay fallow under frost and snow, and serfs turned their attention to repairing tools, mending fences, and ensuring that livestock survived the cold months. Each day was long, beginning with the first light, and ending only when darkness fell. Meals for serfs were simple and repetitive. Bread, often coarse and dark, was a staple, accompanied by porridge made from oats or barley. Vegetables like onions, cabbage, and beans were common, while cheese offered occasional protein. Meat was rare and considered a luxury, often reserved for religious festivals or the tables of the Lord. Food scarcity was a constant concern, and survival often depended on ingenuity and resourcefulness. Clothing reflected both necessity and social status. Serfs wore garments made from coarse wool or linen garments that were functional, durable, and sometimes patched repeatedly. Their attire was plain, devoid of ornamentation, a visual reflection of their social position. Even the color of clothing could indicate status. Bright dyes were reserved for wealthier individuals, while the serf's palette remained muted and practical. The obligations of a serf went beyond personal labor. They were required to perform additional tasks for the Lord, known as labor services. These duties might involve repairing roads, building fences, maintaining mills, or contributing to construction projects on the manor. Such work could be exhausting and unpredictable, depending on the whims or demands of the Lord. Yet it was an integral part of the feudal contractus system that bound the labor of the many to the power of the few. Being a serf was not without some protections. While they lacked personal freedom, the Lord was expected to provide justice, protection from external threats, and the right to cultivate land for their own subsistence. There were occasions when serfs could experience moments of leisure or joy, particularly during church festivals, local fairs, or seasonal celebrations. These moments, though brief, offered respite from the grueling routines of peasant life and were deeply cherished. The life of a serf was also shaped by rules, restrictions, and oversight. They could not leave the land without permission, and marriage required approval from the Lord. Inheritance was limited, often restricted to the right to use the land rather than to own it outright. Children born into serfdom inherited the same obligations, continuing the cycle of labor and service. Disobedience could lead to fines, corporal punishment, or other forms of reprimand. The weight of these restrictions was ever present, shaping the lives, choices, and aspirations of the serfs. Despite these hardships, the lives of serfs were not devoid of meaning. Villages were tight-knit communities where people relied on one another for survival. Families worked together, shared resources, and supported each other during difficult times. Storytelling, music, and communal gatherings created a sense of identity and belonging. Festivals and religious observances provided structure and purpose, offering brief moments of celebration amidst a life dominated by work. Serfdom was not static. Over centuries, social, economic, and demographic changes gradually transformed the lives of peasants. Events such as the Black Death reshaped labor dynamics, sometimes giving serfs greater bargaining power due to labor shortages. These shifts marked the slow erosion of feudal bonds, eventually leading to new social structures and more opportunities for personal freedom. Yet, for centuries, the vast majority of peasants lived and died under the constraints of serfdom, bound to the land that sustained both them and the feudal hierarchy above them. To truly appreciate what it meant to be a serf in medieval England, one must step into their world, a world of labor and obligation, yet also of resilience and community. The life of a serf was harsh, often unforgiving. Yet, it was also rich with human connections, perseverance, and the small joys that endured. Despite adversity, through their experiences, we gain a window into the social and economic structures of medieval England, understanding how ordinary people lived, struggled, and shaped the course of history in ways that are often overlooked. As we continue this exploration in the next part, we will delve deeper into the daily routines of serfs, uncovering the rhythm of their work, the simplicity of their meals, and the relentless demands of their obligations. We will see not just the toil, but also the humanity that persisted in these villages, the ways serfs created meaning, and the subtle ways in which they navigated a world designed to limit their freedom. By understanding their lives, we come closer to understanding the fabric of medieval society itself. The story of the serf is not just a story of labor and hardship. It is a story of endurance, community, and the human spirit in the face of relentless challenge. Welcome to the world of medieval England, as seen through the eyes of those who lived at its foundation, the serfs, whose labor sustained a system larger than themselves, and whose lives, though constrained, were filled with resilience, connection, and the simple joys that made life bearable. As we step further into the world of medieval England, it is impossible to overstate the central role that work played in the life of a serf. Unlike modern lives, where work is often compartmentalized, serfdom was not just a job, it was existence itself. From the first light of morning to the fading glow of evening, a serf's life revolved entirely around the land and the demands of the Lord. Each day was structured by the rhythm of the seasons, the necessities of survival, and the unyielding expectations of a system that required constant labor. Picture the village at sunrise. Smoke curls from the chimneys of the cottages, and roosters crow as sunlight touches the fields. Serfs rise from their simple bed, soften a straw mattress on the earthen floor, and begin their day. There is no room for leisure, no time for idleness. The day's work begins immediately, dictated by the tasks that must be accomplished to feed their families, satisfy the Lord, and endure the cycles of nature. The year was divided into seasons, each bringing its own set of challenges. Spring was a particularly busy time. The frozen earth thaws, and fields must be plowed and prepared for planting. Wooden plows, often drawn by oxen, cut furrows into the soil, and the serfs sowed seeds by hand, scattering them with careful attention to spacing and depth. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat formed the staples of their subsistence. Spring was a time of hope, but if the weather was too wet, too dry, or if a late frost came, the harvest could fail, threatening the village with hunger for months to come. Summer brought its own intensity. Fields needed constant attention to prevent weeds from overtaking the crops. Serfs were often up before dawn and worked under the sun's harsh glare, tending livestock, repairing fences, and ensuring irrigation systems, usually simple channels, functioned correctly. Cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens required daily care, feeding, and monitoring. Any neglect could lead to losses which directly affected both the serf family and the lord, who demanded a share of the produce. Autumn was perhaps the most critical season, harvest time. The work became even more strenuous as the community banded together to bring in crops before the frost arrived. Harvesting involved cutting stalks with sickles, binding them into sheaves, and transporting them to barns for storage. A portion of the harvest was claimed by the lord as rent or tax, leaving the remainder for the serf's own use. Despite the exhaustion, harvest was a time of cautious celebration. Festivals marking the end of the season allowed moments of community joy, though they were brief and tempered by the constant reality of labor. Winter was a season of preparation and survival, with fields lying under frost or snow. Serfs turned to maintenance, work preparing tools, patching fences, tending to thatched roofs, and ensuring that the livestock were sheltered and fed. Food became scarcer, and the reliance on stored grain, preserved vegetables, and any remaining meat intensified. The cold months tested not only physical endurance, but ingenuity, as serfs had to make do with limited resources to survive the harsh weather. Meals were simple, repetitive, and designed primarily to sustain energy for labor rather than to provide pleasure. Bread, often coarse and dark, was the staple, accompanied by pottage, thick stew made from grains and vegetables. Cheese and occasional dairy products supplemented the diet, while meat was a rare luxury, consumed mostly during feast days or granted as a reward from the lord. For protein, some serfs relied on eggs, fish, or small game caught locally. Spices and seasonings were scarce and expensive, so flavor was minimal. Water and ale, often homebreweds, served as the primary drinks, with ale being safer than water due to its boiling during brewing. Clothing was another reflection of status and necessity. Serfs wore garments made from coarse wool or rough linen, dyed with natural muted colors derived from plants and minerals. Garments were designed for durability rather than fashion, patched repeatedly as fabrics wore thin. Shoes were simple leather, often homemade, and in winter, serfs might wrap cloth around their feet for warmth. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult clothing, often handed down from older siblings. While the clothing might seem stark to modern eyes, it was sufficient for survival and functioned well for the demands of labor-intensive life. Beyond the cyclical work in the fields, serfs were also obligated to perform labor for the lord's services that went beyond what was necessary to maintain their own plots. These duties were known as labor services, and they could include repairing roads, constructing fences, maintaining mills, clearing forests, or even building parts of the manor. These tasks were often physically demanding and could consume hours each day, leaving serfs exhausted from the combined demands of their personal plots and the lord's expectations. The rhythm of life was punctuated by religious observances, though these were also intertwined with labor. Church attendance, feast days, and holy observances were mandated, but often the celebrations were brief interruptions to the ongoing demands of work. Religious festivals offered both spiritual solace and temporary relief from the grind of labor, reinforcing the cultural and social cohesion of the village. These occasions were also when serfs could come together as a community, exchange news, share stories, and momentarily escape the relentless routines of agricultural life. A serf's work was not only physically taxing, but also mentally exhausting. Every decision carried consequences. Planting too early or too late, failing to tend livestock adequately, or neglecting labor obligations could result in penalties from the lord. Overseers and bailiffs monitored the work of the serfs, ensuring that quotas were met and that the lord's property was protected. The fear of punishment was ever present, shaping behavior and reinforcing the social hierarchy. Despite these hardships, serfs found ways to cope and create meaning in their labor. Community bonds were essential. Families often worked together, with parents teaching children the skills they would need to survive and contribute to the household. Villagers supported each other during illness, crop failure, or other misfortunes. Social networks within the village were vital, creating a system of mutual aid that allowed survival even under difficult circumstances. Education for serfs was limited. Most children learned practical skills, how to farm, tend animals, mend clothes, and navigate the obligations of the feudal system. Literacy was rare, confined to clergy or the nobility, leaving serfs reliant on oral tradition and practical knowledge. Storytelling, songs, and local legends were important cultural tools, passing down moral lessons, historical memory, and shared values from generation to generation. The physical environment also dictated the rhythms of life. Villages were typically located near water sources for drinking and irrigation, with fields surrounding the central cluster of homes. Forests provided timber for construction, fuel for fires, and game for food, while rivers and streams supported fishing. Serfs adapted to their environment, using local resources to sustain themselves and mitigate the challenges posed by weather, soil quality, and seasonal variation. Labor-intensive as life was, serfs had moments of ingenuity and creativity. They developed simple tools to ease farming tasks, experimented with crop rotation, and managed livestock carefully to maximize survival. Every action was calculated to sustain life, feed the family, and satisfy the obligations imposed by the feudal hierarchy. Despite the harshness of their daily work, there was an understanding of the land, the seasons, and the interconnectedness of life and knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. The life of a serf was also shaped by law and custom. They were not free to leave the land without permission, and every action was subject to the oversight of the lord and his stewards. Marriage, inheritance, and property usage were regulated, ensuring that the labor and allegiance of the serfs remained tied to the manor. The weight of these obligations defined existence. Yet, within the boundaries imposed, serfs carved out lives filled with meaning, connection, and resilience. Even the smallest pleasures, a shared meal, a festival, a tended garden, were deeply significant. Work defined life, but community, family, and faith gave it context and purpose. Serfs were not merely laborers, they were caretakers of the land, participants in a complex social and economic system, and bearers of traditions that would shape England for centuries to come. Through this lens, we begin to see that serfdom was far more than a set of duties. It was a way of life, a world of early mornings and long days, of toil and perseverance, yet also one of community, survival, and ingenuity. By understanding the daily life of a serf, we gain insight not only into their struggles, but also into their strength, their adaptability, and the intricate social fabric that allowed villages and manors to function for generations. As we continue, the next part will explore the rights and restrictions that governed serf life, the legal and social constraints that framed their existence, and the small protections and opportunities for community that made life bearable within a harsh and hierarchical society. To fully understand the life of a serf in medieval England, it is essential to grasp the framework of rights and restrictions that defined their existence. Serfs occupied a precarious position in the social hierarchy, bound to the land, yet not entirely without protections. Their daily lives, choices, and even their future were dictated not only by labor demands, but also by a complex web of customs, legal obligations, and feudal expectations. The balance between constraint and limited autonomy shaped the essence of serfdom, determining how individuals lived, worked, and related to one another. Serfs were bound to the land they inhabited, a condition that defined their identity from birth to death. Unlike free peasants who could own property, trade, or move between villages, serfs could not leave the manor without explicit permission from the lord. This bond was not simply a suggestion, but a legal obligation. Leaving the land without consent could be considered desertion, punishable by fines or corporal punishment. Serfs were, in essence, tethered to the soil they farmed, and this tether defined every aspect of their social and economic existence. Children born to serfs inherited the same obligations automatically. There was no escape from this status. It was a hereditary condition. From the moment of birth, a child was destined to live under the same restrictions as their parents, bound to serve the lord of the manor for the majority of their life. Education was limited and primarily practical, focusing on skills needed for survival and labor rather than intellectual pursuits or literacy. Thus, the cycle of serfdom perpetuated itself, generation after generation, reinforcing the rigid social structure of medieval England. Marriage was another aspect of life strictly regulated by the lord. Serfs could not simply choose a spouse freely. Approval from the lord was often required, particularly if the union involved moving from one manor to another. This control ensured that labor remained tied to the estate, and that the lord could influence alliances and property within the community. Weddings, while celebrated within the village, were subject to feudal oversight, highlighting the intersection of personal life and social obligation in the lives of serfs. Inheritance, too, was tightly controlled. Serfs typically did not own the land they worked. They had rights to use it to cultivate crops, raise livestock, and support their families, but these rights were contingent on their service to the lord. When a serf passed away, land could not be passed as property in the modern sense. Instead, rights to use the land were transferred according to the customs of the manor. Often, only one child, usually the eldest, might inherit the family's plot, while other children had to negotiate for space, marry into another serf household, or take on additional labor duties. This system maintained the continuity of labor on the land, while preventing fragmentation of the manor's resources. Yet, despite these restrictions, serfs were not entirely without protections. Feudal law imposed certain responsibilities on the lord, ensuring that the peasants under his control were not left utterly vulnerable. The lord was expected to provide protection from external threats such as raids, theft, or violence from neighboring estates. This protection was not merely a favor, but part of the reciprocal obligations embedded within feudalism. Serfs owed labor, tribute, and loyalty, while the lord owed security and access to land. Justice was another sphere in which serfs, minor courts, often overseen by the lord or his steward, adjudicated disputes, enforced fines, and resolved conflicts within the village. Serfs could appeal decisions, though success often depended on the social standing of the parties involved and the lord's disposition. While the system was inherently biased toward the landowning elite, it did provide a framework for resolving conflicts and offered a degree of legal recognition for the grievances of peasants. The church also played a crucial role in regulating serf life and rights. Religious doctrine reinforced the social hierarchy, but simultaneously provided moral guidance and a sense of spiritual equity. Serfs were obligated to pay tithes, typically a tenth of their produce, to the local parish, supporting the clergy and the upkeep of the church. In return, the church offered spiritual counsel, education for children in basic literacy and prayers, and a framework for ethical behavior. Religious festivals, saints' days, and holy observances punctuated the calendar, providing temporal relief from the rigors of labor and reinforcing community cohesion. Feasts, festivals, and church holidays were particularly significant in serf life. These occasions were legally sanctioned and socially expected, offering the peasants moments of respite and collective joy. Harvest festivals, for instance, celebrated the completion of months of grueling work, allowing communities to gather, share food, sing, and dance. Even under the burden of labor and regulation, these events reinforced social bonds, moral codes, and cultural continuity. Taxes and dues imposed on serfs were another reflection of their constrained rights. In addition to labor obligations, serfs paid rents, fines, and other levies to the lord. These could include payments in kind such as grain, livestock, or labor services, as well as monetary payments if the manor allowed or demanded it. Failure to meet these obligations could result in severe penalties, from fines to corporal punishment. The system was designed to ensure the steady flow of wealth and labor to the lord while keeping the peasantry economically dependent. While serfs were heavily restricted, they occasionally found ways to assert small degrees of autonomy. Agreements over land use, negotiating labor quotas, and participating in village councils or communal decision-making offered some control over their immediate environment. Their knowledge of local customs and traditions allowed serfs to navigate the complex web of obligations with a measure of agency. Even within a system designed to limit freedom, village life itself was governed by unwritten codes and collective norms. Serfs relied on each other for survival, sharing resources during times of scarcity and coordinating labor for communal tasks such as road repair, irrigation, or harvest. These shared responsibilities fostered a sense of solidarity, providing emotional and practical support within the rigid hierarchy of feudal society. Even in a world dominated by restrictions, community cohesion offered a source of resilience. The physical landscape shaped these rights and restrictions as well. Manor boundaries were closely monitored, ensuring that serfs could not encroach on neighboring lands or exploit resources beyond their assigned plots. Forests, rivers, and common pastures were subject to strict regulations. The lord often controlled access to timber, game, and water resources, and unauthorized use could result in punishment. Serfs were therefore constantly aware of the limits of their mobility, resources, and rights. Living in a world that required obedience while fostering ingenuity within narrow constraints. Punishments for transgressions reflected the balance between law, custom, and power. Minor offenses might result in fines or additional labor obligations, while more serious breaches could bring physical punishment, imprisonment, or public humiliation. The threat of retribution reinforced the social order, ensuring that serfs remained compliant with the demands of the lord and the obligations of the manor. Yet within these boundaries, many serfs developed sophisticated systems for negotiation, persuasion, and cooperation to protect their families and maintain some measure of independence. Religious institutions sometimes mediated conflicts or provided protection against harsh punishments. Priests and monks could intervene on behalf of serfs, citing moral authority and spiritual obligations to temper the exercise of secular power. The Church's involvement reinforced the dual nature of medieval life. Serfs were bound by earthly restrictions, but also existed within a moral and spiritual framework that offered guidance, support, and occasional reprieve from secular authority. Over time, societal changes subtly reshaped these rights and restrictions. Events such as plagues, wars, and demographic shifts influenced the bargaining power of serfs, sometimes allowing them to negotiate better conditions or secure greater freedom. The Black Death, for instance, dramatically reduced the population, creating labor shortages and providing serfs with opportunities to demand improved terms or wages. These shifts highlight that while serfs were constrained by law and custom, the system was not entirely rigid and could adapt under pressure, sometimes to the benefit of the peasants themselves. Despite these small opportunities, life for a serf was defined by constraint. Travel, marriage, property rights, and personal choice were all restricted by law, custom, and economic necessity. The weight of obligation was ever present, and the daily reality of survival required constant attention to labor, resources, and relationships. Even so, serfs navigated these limitations with creativity, resourcefulness, and resilience, developing systems of support, knowledge, and community that allowed them to endure within the strictures of feudal life. In essence, the life of a serf was a delicate balance between restriction and resilience. While they were legally and socially constrained, serfs cultivated their own sense of agency within the framework of obligation. Rights existed, but they were limited, often contingent on obedience, loyalty, and the maintenance of social harmony. Restrictions were pervasive, yet the ingenuity, cooperation, and cultural cohesion of the peasant community allowed life to continue, offering stability, identity, and meaning amidst the harsh realities of feudal rule. Understanding these rights and restrictions provides a window into the daily realities of medieval England. The lives of serfs were shaped not only by labor, but by law, custom, and the intricate web of obligations that bound individuals to their communities, the land, and the lord. By examining these factors, we gain insight into how medieval society functioned, the balance between power and protection, and the ways in which ordinary people navigated a world that limited freedom yet fostered resilience, adaptation, and community cohesion. In the next part, we will delve into the challenges and hardships faced by serfs, diseases, famines, punishments, and environmental pressures that made survival a constant struggle. We will explore how these hardships tested the resilience of the peasantry and how serfs coped with the relentless demands of life under feudal rule. Life as a serf in medieval England was defined not only by labor and obligation, but also by the constant presence of challenges and hardships. To live as a serf was to navigate a world in which survival was never guaranteed, where environmental, social, and economic pressures intersected to shape every day. Disease, famine, harsh winters, and strict enforcement of feudal obligations were a constant reality. Understanding these hardships provides critical insight into the resilience, ingenuity, and communal bonds that allowed serfs to endure. Centuries of life bound to the land. The physical environment was both a provider and a threat. Serfs relied entirely on the land for food, shelter, and raw materials. The fertility of the soil, rainfall patterns, and seasonal cycles. A failed harvest could spell disaster, leaving families without enough grain to survive the winter. Agricultural technology was primitive by modern standards. Wooden plows, simple hoes, and animal labor were the main tools available. Crop yields were low, and any unexpected event, drought, flooding, early frost, could decimate the harvest, causing hunger or even death. Famine was a common and ever-present threat. Food scarcity could arise from a bad harvest, disease affecting livestock, or disruption caused by war or raiding parties. When famine struck, serfs had few options. They could consume seeds intended for the next planting, risking future harvests for forage in forests for roots, nuts, or game, often illegally, risking punishment. Community cooperation became essential, as neighbors would share what little they had, pooling resources to survive the harshest periods. Yet despite collective effort, famine frequently claimed lives, leaving a permanent mark on the population and the culture of peasant communities. Disease was another relentless adversary. Medieval villages were densely packed, sanitation was minimal, and access to medical knowledge was limited. Outbreaks of infectious diseases, from smallpox to dysentery, could spread rapidly, taking lives indiscriminately. The Black Death was particularly devastating, wiping out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of England's population. For surviving serfs, the plague was both a curse and an opportunity. Labor shortages meant that those who survived could sometimes demand better conditions or wages, subtly shifting the balance of power within the feudal system. Nevertheless, the immediate effect was overwhelming grief, fear, and social disruption. Weather and climate further shaped the hardships of serf life. Winters were long, cold, and unforgiving. Homes were poorly insulated, and heating relied on small hearth fires, which provided only partial relief from frost and damp. Illnesses such as pneumonia, scurvy, and hypothermia were common in harsh conditions. Spring and summer brought their own dangers. Floods could destroy crops, while storms could damage homes and barns. Serfs were entirely at the mercy of these environmental forces. Their labor, preparation, and ingenuity tested year after year. The labor itself, while necessary, was grueling and unrelenting. Serfs worked from morning until nightfall, and during harvest time, days could extend well into the evening. Repetitive, physically exhausting tasks such as plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting required not only strength but stamina. Mistakes had consequences. A poorly planted field could reduce the family's share of the harvest, invite punishment from the Lord, and exacerbate hunger. Livestock demanded daily attention. Any illness or death among animals directly threatened the household's survival and the fulfillment of feudal dues. Animals could devastate a household's economy and diet. In addition to these natural hardships, the legal and social enforcement of feudal obligations was another source of strain. Serfs were constantly monitored by the lord's bailiffs and stewards to ensure that labor, taxes, and duties were fulfilled. Failure to comply could result in fines, additional work, or corporal punishment. Public punishments were not uncommon, serving as both retribution and deterrence. The fear of reprisal shaped the daily behavior of serfs, adding a psychological burden to the already immense physical demands of life. Serfs were also vulnerable to exploitation. Beyond formal labor obligations, lords could demand additional services during times of need, such as contributing labor to fortifications, providing soldiers for local conflicts, or supporting military campaigns. These extraordinary duties could be exhausting and disruptive, stretching the limits of a serf family's energy and resources. Such demands were often unpredictable, leaving serfs with little time to plan or rest. The economic vulnerability of serfs further compounded hardship. Because they did not own land outright, they depended on the lord for the right to cultivate fields and access common resources such as pastures, woods, and water sources. Poor management by the lord or competition for limited resources could lead to disputes, crop failure, and social tension. Additionally, fines for minor infractions could deplete already scarce household resources, leaving families on the brink of poverty. Serfs had little control over these economic pressures and were forced to adapt constantly to survive. Famine, disease, harsh labor, and economic vulnerability all intersected with social constraints to create a life of unrelenting pressure. Yet, serfs developed strategies to cope. Villages were tightly knit, and mutual aid was a cornerstone of survival. Families shared labor and resources, ensuring that fields were maintained and that everyone had access to food and shelter during hard times. Skills were passed down orally and through practice, enabling younger generations to navigate a complex and often hostile environment. Serfs also relied on local knowledge of the land, weather patterns, and medicinal plants to mitigate the effects of disease and environmental hardship. Religion played a dual role in the lives of serfs, offering both comfort and structure. The church provided moral guidance and a sense of purpose, helping villagers to endure suffering as part of a divine plan. Monks, priests, and local religious leaders sometimes provided rudimentary medical care, counseling, and mediation in disputes, offering support in a world otherwise dominated by hardship. Religious festivals and holy days offered brief relief from labor, moments of communal joy and celebration that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. Despite these supports, the cumulative effect of hardships was profound. Life expectancy for a serf was significantly shorter than that of nobility, and childhood mortality was high. Physical labor from a young age, combined with inadequate nutrition and exposure to disease, shaped the experiences of every generation. Families often lived with the constant anxiety of illness, crop failure, or punitive action from the lord. The psychological burden of such a life was immense. Yet serfs developed resilience, relying on community, faith, and practical knowledge to endure. Conflict and violence were additional hardships faced by serfs. Raids from rival lords, bandits, or foreign invaders threatened life and property. While the lord was expected to provide protection, the effectiveness of that protection varied. Villagers sometimes organized collective defense-building fences, ditches, and watchtowers, or forming armed groups to protect their homes. Nevertheless, the ever-present possibility of violence added another layer of stress to an already challenging existence. Despite these relentless hardships, serfs found ways to assert agency and maintain dignity. They formed social networks, exchanged information and labor, and cultivated a sense of shared identity. Work itself could foster community-shared fields, joint tasks, and cooperative harvests created bonds that were essential for survival. Even within the strict limitations imposed by feudal obligations, serfs developed a culture of mutual support, resilience, and problem-solving over time. Certain systemic changes altered the nature of hardship. Population decline following the Black Death shifted labor dynamics, increasing the leverage of surviving serfs to demand better conditions or wages. Technological innovations, such as improved plows or crop rotation techniques, gradually reduced the intensity of some labor demands. While these shifts did not eliminate hardship, they highlight the dynamic interaction between environmental, social, and economic pressures and the ways serfs adapted to survive. Ultimately, the challenges and hardships faced by serfs were a defining aspect of their existence. Life was dominated by the constant struggle against environmental pressures, disease, economic vulnerability, and social constraints. Yet within this struggle, serfs exhibited remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity. World designed to limit freedom and test endurance, creating communities and strategies that allowed them not only to survive but to persist across generations. Understanding these hardships provides critical insight into medieval society as a whole. The survival strategies, cultural practices, and resilience of serfs shaped the very fabric of the feudal system. Their endurance under extreme conditions offers a window into the human capacity to adapt, is relentlessly demanding. As we move to the next part, we will explore the hidden power within the serf community, how resilience, ingenuity, and social bonds allowed peasants to navigate oppression, negotiate limited freedoms, and preserve their humanity under the constraints of medieval life. While life as a serf in medieval England was undeniably defined by toil, obligation, and hardship, there existed a quiet, often overlooked force that sustained these communities, the hidden power within the serfs themselves. This power was not political in the conventional sense, nor was it tied to wealth or land ownership. Instead, it was social, cultural, and psychological, a combination of resilience, ingenuity, communal cohesion, and subtle negotiation that allowed serfs to navigate the harsh realities of feudal life. By examining this hidden strength, we uncover a narrative of human adaptability, resourcefulness, and collective endurance that lies beneath the surface of labor and oppression. One of the most significant aspects of this hidden power was community cohesion. Serfs did not live as isolated individuals. The survival of each family often depended on the cooperation of neighbors, whether in planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, or maintaining common infrastructure such as roads, ditches, and fences. This interdependence fostered a network of mutual aid, trust, and shared responsibility that became a form of social capital. Through this network, serfs could mitigate some of the harshness imposed by the lord, the environment, and economic pressures. Community cohesion also manifested in cultural practices and traditions. Festivals, religious celebrations, and communal gatherings were not merely moments of leisure. They were mechanisms for reinforcing social bonds and collective identity. During harvest festivals, for instance, the work of an entire village would be recognized and celebrated, offering psychological relief and strengthening morale. Songs, stories, and local legends passed orally from one generation to the next enforced shared values, moral lessons, and collective memory. These cultural practices constituted a hidden power, an intangible force that maintained solidarity and resilience even under extreme pressure. Another crucial element of the serf's hidden power was practical ingenuity. Bound to the land and constrained by law, serfs nevertheless developed sophisticated knowledge systems for survival. They understood the cycles of the seasons, the behavior of livestock, and the nuances of soil fertility. They experimented with crop rotation, planting patterns, and storage techniques to maximize yield and minimize risk. They crafted tools and household items from local materials, repairing and reusing objects to reduce waste. Such ingenuity was essential for survival and provided a measure of control over an otherwise unpredictable world. It was a quiet form of mastery over their environment often overlooked by the lords, who considered them mere laborers. Within the manor, serfs also demonstrated social intelligence and negotiation skills. While legally bound, they were not entirely powerless. Understanding the customs, expectations, and dispositions of the lord, the bailiffs, and other overseers allowed serfs to navigate the system with subtlety. For example, they might negotiate the timing of labor obligations, offer services at moments of strategic advantage, or use social networks to advocate for fair treatment. These small acts of negotiation were not rebellion in the conventional sense, but represented a form of agency that allowed serfs to influence their conditions, protect their families, and exercise a degree of autonomy within the constraints imposed upon them. Religious faith was another pillar of the hidden power within serf communities. The church, while reinforcing the hierarchical structure, provided spiritual guidance, moral education, and a framework for understanding suffering. Serfs interpreted their hardships as part of a divine order, and religious practices offered both comfort and structure. Daily prayers, participation in masses, and observance of feast days provided meaning and ritualized outlets for stress, grief, and anxiety. The psychological resilience derived from faith was a subtle but critical power, enabling serfs to endure conditions that might otherwise seem unbearable. The structure of serf life also gave rise to informal leadership and mentorship within the community. Older or more experienced serfs often guided younger members, passing down skills, knowledge, and strategies for survival. This mentorship extended beyond agriculture to include household management, navigation of feudal obligations, and social behavior. Elders held authority, not through official titles, but through experience and respect, providing a stabilizing influence within the village. Their guidance allowed communities to maintain continuity, adapt to changing conditions, and transmit collective wisdom across generations. Economic strategies also formed part of this hidden power. While serfs lacked property ownership in the modern sense, they found ways to maximize the value of what they had. They might cultivate additional plots for personal use, barter goods and labor with neighbors, or manage livestock strategically to provide a buffer against crop failure. These strategies required foresight, careful planning, and cooperation with others in the village. By leveraging their limited resources creatively, serfs could secure a measure of stability and self-reliance, even within the constraints of feudal obligations. The ability of serfs to organize collectively, whether through cooperation in labor, mutual aid, or subtle negotiation, was another critical element of hidden power. Villages often operated on unwritten agreements, customs, and norms that ensured equitable distribution of work, shared use of common resources, and protection of the most vulnerable members. These arrangements were essential for survival, particularly during times of scarcity or crisis. Even under strict feudal oversight, the collective power of the community provided a counterbalance to the authority of the lord, allowing serfs to exercise influence through unity rather than confrontation, physical and psychological. Resilience was also a key component of the hidden power of serfs. The daily demands of labor, exposure to disease, and threat of punishment required extraordinary stamina. Yet serfs endured, finding ways to maintain health, manage stress, and preserve energy for essential tasks. This resilience was cultivated through routine, skill, and community support. Simple practices such as shared work during planting or harvest, rotation of labor, and careful planning of food and supplies were critical strategies for maintaining endurance. The ability to persevere despite adversity was a profound form of power that allowed serfs to survive in a world designed to test them constantly. Education, though limited, was another form of hidden power. Children learned essential skills from an early age, acquiring knowledge through observation, apprenticeship, and oral instruction. They learned to identify edible plants, manage crops, care for livestock, repair tools, and navigate social hierarchies. This practical education ensured that each generation was capable of sustaining itself, maintaining the continuity of the village, and adapting to changing circumstances. In a sense, knowledge itself was a form of power transmitted quietly and resiliently across generations. Serfs also found power in subtle forms of resistance. While outright rebellion was rare and dangerous, small acts such as taking slightly longer breaks, negotiating labor assignments, or using clever techniques to improve crop yields represented the exercise of agency within a restrictive system. These acts did not overthrow the feudal hierarchy, but they allowed serfs to assert their needs, protect their families, and claim small measures of freedom within a life largely dictated by obligation. Finally, the ultimate expression of hidden power was the ability to endure and adapt. Despite the harsh conditions, constant labor, disease, scarcity, and social restrictions, serfs persisted. They navigated the complexities of feudal obligations, environmental uncertainty, and community dynamics with ingenuity and resilience through cooperation, knowledge, cultural continuity, and subtle agency. Serfs transformed a life of constraint into one of enduring strength. This hidden power was quiet, often invisible to those in authority. Yet it was profound, shaping the persistence of communities and the continuity of medieval society itself. In conclusion, the life of a serf in medieval England was not defined solely by hardship and labor. Beneath the surface of toil and obligation lay a web of hidden power: resilience, communal cohesion, ingenuity, practical knowledge, subtle negotiation, and cultural continuity. This power allowed serfs to survive, adapt, and sustain their communities across generations, providing a counterbalance to the harsh realities of feudal life. By recognizing this hidden strength, we gain a deeper understanding of medieval society, the endurance of ordinary people, and the human capacity to create meaning, agency, and resilience, even under the most challenging conditions. As we move to the final part of our series, we will explore the price of devotion, the sacrifices, moral burdens, and ultimate costs that accompanied life as a serf, tying together the threads of labor, hardship, community, and hidden power into a full picture of medieval peasant life. As we reach the final part of our journey into the lives of serfs in medieval England, we come to a sobering reality. Devotion came at a price. Throughout their existence, serfs navigated a world of ceaseless labor, social constraints, environmental threats, and hierarchical oversight. Yet underlying every aspect of their life work in the fields, service to the Lord, adherence to communal and religious norms, was a profound devotion to family, to community, to faith, and to survival itself. This devotion shaped daily routines, informed decision-making, and guided moral and social conduct, and yet it exacted costs, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual, that defined the lived experience of medieval peasants. The most immediate price of devotion was physical exhaustion. Serfs labored incessantly, plowing, sowing, tending livestock, repairing fences, and gathering harvests were only part of the daily demands. Beyond their own plots, labor obligations to the lord of the manor, whether repairing roads, maintaining mills, or constructing buildings, added layers of exertion. Their bodies bore the weight of tools, the strain of repetitive tasks, and the relentless pressure to sustain life. Muscles ached, backs hunched under the weight of labor, and injuries were common with little access to medical care. The devotion to work, necessary for family survival and to fulfill feudal obligations, came at a continuous cost to health and vitality. Nutrition compounded these physical challenges. Meals were simple, repetitive, and insufficient to fully sustain energy for the demands of labor. Bread, coarse porridge, vegetables, and occasional dairy formed the bulk of the diet, while meat was a rare luxury. Famine or poor harvests could exacerbate nutritional deficiencies, weakening bodies and making them more susceptible to disease. Yet serfs endured, demonstrating devotion not only to labor and obligation, but to the very act of survival, feeding themselves and their families against the odds. Beyond the physical toll, serfs paid a profound emotional and psychological price. The hierarchical structures of feudalism imposed constant oversight, scrutiny, and pressure. Every decision, how to allocate labor, when to plant crops, how to fulfill obligations, carried consequences. Punishments for failure or disobedience, whether fines, extra labor, or corporal reprimand loomed as constant threats. Anxiety, fear, and uncertainty were integral to daily life. Serfs devoted themselves to labor and obedience, not just out of necessity, but to maintain stability and avoid the consequences of deviation. This psychological weight, carried day after day, shaped the inner life of every peasant in medieval England. Family obligations were another arena in which devotion exacted a price. Serfs devoted their lives to ensuring the survival of their children, teaching skills and preparing them for a life constrained by the same obligations. Children were expected to contribute to labor from a young age, learning to plow fields, tend animals, and assist with household chores. Parents' devotion to nurturing and guiding the next generation came at the expense of rest, leisure, and personal freedom. Education was practical rather than intellectual, focused on survival rather than aspiration. And yet this devotion ensured continuity, the survival of the family and the community. Communal devotion also carried costs. Serfs relied on one another for mutual aid, cooperation in labor, and protection against environmental and social threats. Yet this reliance required conformity, negotiation, and the sacrifice of individual autonomy for collective survival. Disputes had to be managed carefully. Labor had to be coordinated efficiently. Resources shared judiciously. Social cohesion demanded constant attention and energy, and failure to participate could endanger not only one's own family but the broader community. Devotion to the collective came with responsibility and often personal sacrifice. Religious devotion, while offering solace and structure, also exacted its own price. Serfs were expected to tithe a portion of their produce to the church, attend services, observe holy days, and participate in rituals. These obligations, while spiritually fulfilling for some, added another layer of labor and time commitment. Religious observances often coincided with agricultural cycles, requiring peasants to balance faith and work carefully. The moral and ethical expectations imposed by religious institutions demanded personal discipline, humility, and adherence to a moral code, adding complexity to an already challenging existence. The moral and spiritual price of devotion was intertwined with obedience. Serfs were taught to accept their position in the social hierarchy as part of a divine order. Discontent, rebellion, or resistance was often framed as sinful or morally wrong. This internalized hierarchy required devotion to a system that limited freedom, reinforcing social compliance while demanding moral and spiritual alignment. For many serfs, this meant reconciling personal suffering and hardship with a belief in justice, divine providence, and the moral order, psychological labor as taxing as physical work. Economic devotion also exacted costs. Serfs owed rent, taxes, and labor to the lordofan, consuming the best of their own resources. A portion of their harvest was taken, leaving only what was necessary to sustain families. Failure to meet obligations could result in fines or additional work. Serfs devoted energy, time, and produce to the manor, ensuring its prosperity while often living precariously themselves. Economic devotion required careful planning, efficiency, and constant vigilances. Scarcity and mismanagement could threaten survival. Environmental challenges intersected with devotion, amplifying the costs. Serfs worked within a fragile ecosystem, vulnerable to droughts, floods, and harsh winters. Devotion to the land required both physical labor and intimate knowledge: when to plant, when to harvest, how to manage livestock, and how to store food for lean months. These skills were essential for survival, but demanded mental acuity, endurance, and relentless attention. Mistakes could result in crop failure, famine, or illness, making the stakes of devotion extraordinarily high. The hidden power we explored in the previous part, the resilience, ingenuity, and communal bonds, was closely linked to the price of devotion. Every act of clever negotiation, cooperative labor, or resourceful planning involved energy, risk, and personal sacrifice. Maintaining social cohesion, preserving cultural traditions, and sustaining collective survival required constant commitment. Serfs devoted themselves to these practices not only out of necessity, but as a moral, social, and practical imperative. The costs were significant, yet they ensured survival, community stability, and the transmission of knowledge and culture to future generations. Violence and conflict also contributed to the cost of devotion. Serfs were obligated to defend their homes and fields when threatened, whether by raiders, rival lords, or bandits. While they relied on the lord for protection, this was never absolute, and the burden of safeguarding property and family often fell on the peasants themselves. Devotion to survival and communal well-being required courage, vigilance, and physical endurance, exacting both immediate danger and long-term psychological strain. Health was continually at risk. Labor, malnutrition, exposure, and disease created a fragile equilibrium. Serfs devoted their energy to maintaining their health, often with minimal tools or knowledge. Herbal remedies, basic hygiene practices, and preventive care were learned through experience and shared knowledge. Yet, despite best efforts, illness and injury were common, creating additional burdens for families who had to redistribute labor or care for the sick. The physical and emotional labor of health maintenance was a continuous, often invisible cost of devotion. The devotion of serfs extended to cultural preservation. Through storytelling, music, festivals, and oral tradition, serfs maintained a sense of identity, moral guidance, and historical continuity. These cultural practices required time, energy, and collective coordination, while labor demands were pressing. The act of preserving culture. Education, though limited, was also a product of devotion. Parents and elders invested time and energy in teaching children essential skills: farming techniques, tool use, household management, and social conduct. This knowledge transfer required patience, energy, and sometimes personal sacrifice, as adults had to balance instruction with labor obligations. Yet, it ensured the survival of families and communities, enabling successive generations to navigate the challenges of life under feudal obligations. Ultimately, the price of devotion was the cumulative toll of physical labor, economic scarcity, social obligation, moral discipline, psychological endurance, and environmental adaptation. Serfs gave themselves to survival, community, faith, and family, often with little reward beyond the mere continuance of life. Yet, within this cost lay a profound testament to human resilience and adaptability. The variability to endure, to maintain identity and cohesion, and to preserve knowledge and culture was a form of empowerment, demonstrating that devotion, even when costly, was inseparable from the survival and vitality of the community. The devotion of serfs also highlights the ethical dimensions of feudal society. While the system imposed immense burdens, it was structured around reciprocal responsibilities. The lord owed protection and access to land. The church offered spiritual guidance. The community provided mutual support. The serf's devotion was, thus, both practical and moral, an expression of commitment to a system that constrained them but also sustained them. The costs of devotion were steep, yet they reinforced the stability and continuity of medieval society, allowing villages, manors, and communities to persist across generations. In conclusion, the life of a serf in medieval England was characterized by devotion that was constant, multifaceted: physical exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, economic scarcity, social constraint, moral discipline, and psychological strain were all part of the price paid. Yet it was precisely this devotion to family, community, labor, culture, and faith that enabled serfs to survive, preserve social cohesion, and transmit knowledge across generations. The price of devotion was high, but the resilience, resourcefulness, and humanity of the serfs transformed hardship into endurance, suffering into continuity, and labor into life. Through understanding the price of devotion, we gain a profound insight into the lives of those who lived under feudal rule. It reminds us that the story of serfs is not only a tale of oppression and hardship, but also one of courage, endurance, and the human capacity to endure, adapt, and sustain community against overwhelming odds. Their devotion shaped medieval society, leaving an enduring legacy of resilience and human strength that echoes through history.